There's a fascinating contradiction at the heart of the avoidant personality, and once you understand it, you'll never look at emotional withdrawal the same way again. The avoidant person has built their entire psychological architecture around one core belief: I am safer alone, not happier, not better, just safer. And there's a difference. Safety to the avoidant mind means control. It means no one can get close enough to disappoint them, abandon them, or expose the parts of themselves they've spent a lifetime hiding. So they do what any logical system does when it detects a threat: they shut down, they pull back, they create distance. And for most people in their lives, that strategy works perfectly. Most people eventually stop trying. Most people take the hint. Most people leave. But then the super empath arrives, and everything the avoidant has carefully constructed begins to shake. Now let's be clear about something: the super empath doesn't arrive with an agenda. They're not trying to fix the avoidant. They're not running a rescue mission. What they bring is something far more disruptive than that. They bring genuine presence. They see what's underneath the walls. They feel the pain that the avoidant has carefully curated into silence. And because the super empath operates from a place of deep emotional intelligence, they respond not with demands, not with ultimatums, but with understanding. And that is the most threatening thing an avoidant has ever encountered. Because here's the psychological reality that most people miss. Avoidants don't fear people who push them. They're built for that. They know how to handle conflict, criticism, neediness. Those are familiar. What they cannot handle is someone who sees them softly, someone who doesn't flinch at their silence, someone who doesn't punish their withdrawal with anger or retaliation, but simply remains steady, present, and real. That kind of love doesn't compute in the avoidant's internal operating system. So what do? They push harder. They go colder. They create more distance, more confusion, more mixed signals, not because they don't care, but because they care too much and have absolutely no architecture to hold that feeling safely. The very thing they've been unconsciously searching for is the thing that terrifies them most. And so the pattern begins: the push and pull, the hot and cold, the moments of connection followed by inexplicable retreat. But here's where it gets deeply interesting. Even after the avoidant has successfully pushed the super empath away, even after they engineered the distance they told themselves they wanted, the super empath doesn't leave their mind. They become a permanent resident in the avoidant's inner world. Why? Because the super empath is the first person who ever made the avoidant feel without forcing it. And that experience doesn't dissolve with distance. It echoes. It resurfaces at 2 a.m. It shows up in the quiet moments when there's no distraction left. The avoidant finds themselves replaying conversations, second-guessing decisions, wondering, not always consciously, what would have happened if I had just let them in. This is not obsession in the romantic sense. This is something philosophically deeper. This is the psyche confronting its own unfinished business. The super empath becomes a mirror that the avoidant cannot put down, no matter how far they run. And the world will tell you the avoidant simply doesn't care. But that's not the truth. The truth is far more complex and far more human than that. The people we push away the hardest are almost always the ones we needed the most, and the avoidant knows it, even if they'll never say it out loud. Now that we understand the paradox of the avoidant, the push and pull, the engineered distance, the haunting that follows, we need to ask the deeper question. Because it's not enough to simply say the super empath is unforgettable. That's a conclusion, not an explanation. And if we're going to truly understand this dynamic, we need to go beneath the surface and ask why. Why this person? Why does the super empath specifically leave an imprint that no one else seems to leave? The answer lies in something most people never experience even once in their lifetime: being truly seen. Think about how rare that actually is. Most of us move through our entire lives being partially known. We show the world a curated version of ourselves, the version that is acceptable, manageable, socially appropriate. And the people around us, consciously or not, agree to the transaction. They take the version we offer, and they don't ask for more. That's how most relationships function. There's an unspoken agreement to stay on the surface, because the surface is comfortable for everyone involved. The avoidant has mastered this transaction. In fact, they've built their entire relational world around it. They are often charming, intelligent, even warm in controlled doses. They know exactly how much of themselves to offer to keep people engaged without ever letting anyone get genuinely close. It's a finely tuned performance, and for most of their lives, the audience never notices it's a performance at all. And then the super empath sits across from them. And within moments, not weeks, not months, but moments, something shifts. Because the super empath is not interested in the performance. They're not dazzled by the charm or satisfied with the curated version. They're reading the silence between the words. They're feeling the weight behind the casual deflection. They're noticing the micro expressions, the subtle contradictions, the moments where the mask slips just slightly and instead of looking away, they look closer. This is not something the avoidant has ever experienced, and it creates a sensation that is genuinely difficult to describe, somewhere between profound relief and absolute terror. Because, on one level, some deep, buried part of the avoidant is exhaling for the first time in years. Someone finally sees me. Not the version I constructed. Not the role I play. Me. And that is intoxicating in a way that nothing else in their life has been. But simultaneously, every defense mechanism they own goes into high alert. Because being seen means being vulnerable. Being vulnerable means being exposed. And being exposed to the avoidant psyche is existentially dangerous. It means someone now has access in their emotional history, has always eventually led to pain. What makes the super empath uniquely devastating to this dynamic is that they don't just see the avoidant, they accept what they see. They don't recoil from the complexity. They don't try to fix the broken parts or negotiate with the walls. They simply hold space for all of it, the light and the shadow, with a kind of unconditional steadiness that the avoidant has likely never encountered from another human being. That is not a small thing. That is, for many avoidants, the single most profound relational experience of their entire lives. And the mind does not forget profound experiences. It stores them. It returns to them. It measures every subsequent connection against them, often without the person even realizing it's doing so. The super empath becomes an internal benchmark, a standard of emotional depth that, once experienced, makes everything shallower feel hollow by comparison. This is why years can pass. New relationships can come and go, and still, quietly, persistently, the super empath remains. When someone sees you completely and loves what they see without condition, you don't get over that. You either rise to meet it or you spend the rest of your life wondering why nothing else ever felt quite real. We've established that the avoidant pushes away the one person who sees them most clearly, and that the super empath leaves an imprint so deep it becomes a permanent internal reference point. But now we need to go somewhere even more uncomfortable. Because if we're going to truly understand this dynamic, not just observe it from the outside, but feel the architecture of it from within, we need to step inside the avoidance inner world and look at what's actually happening beneath the surface of their silence. And what we find there is not indifference. What we find is war. A constant, exhausting, invisible war that the avoidant has been fighting, in most cases, since childhood. Here's the psychological foundation you need to understand. Avoidant attachment doesn't develop in a vacuum. It is almost always the product of an early environment where emotional needs were either consistently dismissed, minimized, or met with unpredictability. The child who reaches out for comfort and is met with emotional unavailability doesn't simply feel sad. They make a decision not consciously, not deliberately, but deeply and permanently that needing people is dangerous. That vulnerability leads to pain. That the safest strategy is to become self-sufficient, emotionally contained, and fundamentally unreachable. And that decision, made by a small child trying to survive their environment, becomes the operating system of the adult. So by the time the avoidant is a grown person sitting across from someone who loves them genuinely and deeply, they are not simply choosing distance. They are running a program that was written decades ago, in a language they don't even consciously speak anymore. The desire for connection is real. The fear of connection is equally real. And both of these forces are running simultaneously, at full intensity, pulling in completely opposite directions. This is the internal war. And the super empath, without even trying, walks directly into the center of it. Because the super empath doesn't just trigger the avoidant's desire for love, they trigger both sides of the conflict at the same time. Their presence says you are safe here, you can open, you can be known, and every part of the avoidant that has been quietly starving for that message responds. It rises up, it leans in, it begins tentatively to hope, and then the alarm system fires. Because hope to the avoidant is not a comfort. Hope is a liability. Hope means you've invested. An investment means you can lose something. And emotional loss, the specific loss of being abandoned or rejected or exposed, is the single most intolerable experience their nervous system knows. So the moment they feel themselves beginning to open, the defense mechanisms mobilize with the full force of decades of conditioning. Withdraw, create distance, find a flaw, Reframe the connection as something less significant than it actually is. Convince yourself you don't need it, and from the outside, this looks like coldness. It looks like cruelty, even. It looks like a person who simply doesn't care. But from the inside, it is anything but cold. From the inside, it is a five-alarm emotional emergency being managed with the only tools available. What makes this particularly profound is that the super empath, with their extraordinary emotional intelligence, often senses the war happening beneath the surface. They don't just see the withdrawal, they feel the conflict underneath it. They understand on some intuitive level that the coldness is not the truth of the person, and so they stay patient, they stay present. They continue to offer safety in the face of being pushed away, which paradoxically makes the avoidance internal war even more intense. Because now they cannot even justify the withdrawal with the narrative that the super empath doesn't really understand them. They do understand, and they're staying anyway. And that someone staying anyway is so foreign, so outside the avoidance relational template that it doesn't feel like love. It feels like a trap, not because it is a trap, but because the avoidance nervous system has no category for unconditional presence that doesn't eventually come with a cost. This is the cruelest dimension of avoidant attachment, not that they don't feel, but that they feel everything and have been conditioned to treat their own feelings as the enemy. The super empath doesn't create the war. The war was already there, long before the super empath arrived. What the super empath does is illuminate it so clearly, so completely, that the avoidant can no longer pretend it isn't happening. And that illumination, as painful as it is also the first condition necessary for healing. The avoidant is not fighting you. They are fighting themselves, and the tragedy is that the person they're pushing away is often the only one who ever understood that the war was never really about them at all. We've journeyed deep into the avoidant's internal world, the paradox of their longing, the imprint of being truly seen, the invisible war raging beneath their silence, and by now, a picture is forming. A picture of someone who is not broken beyond repair but deeply conditioned. Someone who has been running a survival program so long they've mistaken it for their personality. And into that world, the super empath arrived not with force, not with strategy, but with something far more powerful than either, with genuine, unconditional presence. But here's where the story takes a turn that most people don't anticipate, because the common assumption is that the super empath, being as loving and perceptive as they are, will simply continue to wait, continue to hold space, continue to absorb the avoidance withdrawal with patience and understanding indefinitely, because that is what their nature compels them to do. And for a time, that is exactly what happens. But the super empath is not a bottomless well. They are not a saint without needs or a martyr without limits. They are a deeply feeling human being who, like anyone, can only extend themselves into a space of emotional unavailability for so long before something fundamental shifts within them. And when that shift happens, when the super empath finally, quietly, authentically stops, it does not look like the exits the avoidant has witnessed before. And that difference changes everything. Here's what the avoidant is accustomed to. They are accustomed to people leaving in ways that confirm their existing beliefs. People leave angry. People leave with ultimatums. People leave with dramatic declarations or bitter resentment or the specific emotional chaos that allows the avoidant to say, internally, see, this is why I don't let people in. This is what closeness always becomes. Every dramatic exit is, in a perverse way, a relief. It validates the program. It reinforces the wall. It gives the avoidance nervous system exactly the evidence it was always looking for to justify the distance. But the super empath doesn't leave that way. When the super empath finally reaches their limit, they don't rage. They don't beg. They don't issue ultimatums or manufacture crisis to provoke a response. What they do is something the avoidant has almost never encountered in a relational context. They simply withdraw their energy. Quietly, cleanly, without performance or punishment. They stop reaching. They stop interpreting. They stop holding space for a connection that was only ever fully inhabited by one of them. And they do it not out of spite or strategy, but out of a profound act of self-respect. They choose themselves. And to the avoidant who has spent years consciously or unconsciously testing whether people will stay, whether love is truly unconditional, whether someone will finally prove that closeness doesn't have to end in pain, this quiet, dignified departure lands like nothing else ever has. Because they don't know what to do with it. Every other exit gave them a role to play. The wronged party. The emotionally unavailable one who just wasn't ready. The person who needed more space than their partner could give. These are familiar narratives. They fit neatly into the avoidance self-concept. But the super empath's exit offers none of that scaffolding. There is no anger to deflect, no neediness to criticize, no emotional chaos to use as justification. There is simply a person who loved them completely, saw them fully, stayed longer than anyone else, and then, with extraordinary grace, let go. That grace is what breaks through. Not the love itself, paradoxically, though the love was profound. Not the understanding, though it was unlike anything the avoidant had experienced. It is the leaving that finally penetrates the wall. Because the super empath's departure carries a message that no amount of presence could deliver as powerfully. I value myself enough to walk away from what isn't working, and I did it without destroying you in the process. To a person whose entire relational history has been built around the belief that love always eventually becomes dangerous, that intimacy always eventually leads to pain, witnessing someone leave without causing pain is a revelation. It rewrites, at least partially, the very narrative the avoidant has been living inside. And this is the moment, often the first real moment, where the avoidant begins to understand what they have actually lost. Not in the abstract, theoretical way they may have intellectually acknowledged before, but viscerally, in the body. In the silence of a room that used to hold someone's warmth and no longer does. The super empath, by finally honoring their own worth, accomplishes what no amount of patience or pursuit ever could. They show the avoidant in the clearest possible terms that love without self-respect is not love at all. That genuine connection requires two people willing to be present, and that presence, once withdrawn by someone who truly had it to give, leaves a silence that is almost impossible to fill. This is not a tactic. This is not a manipulation. This is simply what happens when a person of genuine emotional depth finally aligns their actions with their value. The super empath didn't break the pattern by staying. They broke it by leaving with such dignity that the avoidant had no choice but to finally look at what they had chosen to lose and ask themselves, for the first time, whether the wall was ever worth what it cost them. We've arrived at perhaps the most emotionally complex territory of this entire conversation. Because up until this point, we've been examining the dynamic largely from the outside, observing the patterns, understanding the psychology, tracing the architecture of the avoidant's behavior, and the super empath's response. But now we need to go somewhere quieter, somewhere more private. We need to step into the space that exists after the super empath has gone into the interior of the avoidance experience, when there is no longer anyone to push away, no longer any connection to manage or distance to. Engineer. We need to talk about what gets left behind. And what gets left behind is not nothing. What gets left behind is a specific, layered emotional residue that the avoidant is profoundly ill-equipped to process, because processing emotion is the very thing their entire psychological system was built to avoid. For the first time, perhaps in their entire relational history, they are sitting with feelings they cannot intellectualize away, cannot distract themselves from indefinitely, and cannot simply reframe into something more manageable. They are sitting with guilt, with regret, and with a longing so deep and so unfamiliar that many avoidants don't even have language for it. Let's start with the guilt, because it is often the first thing to surface, and it surfaces in ways the avoidant doesn't always recognize as guilt. It shows up as irritability, as a vague restlessness that follows them through their days, as a tendency to replay specific moments, not the grand gestures or the obvious turning points, but the small ones. The moment they went cold when warmth was offered. The time they deflected a genuine question with a joke. The evening they chose distance when the super empath had quietly, vulnerably reached out. These micro moments accumulate in the avoidance memory with surprising precision, because the psyche stores what the conscious mind refused to fully acknowledge in real time. And the guilt is complicated by something the avoidant may be confronting honestly for the first time: the recognition that the super empath did nothing wrong. There is no villain to assign in this story. There is no betrayal to point to, no unreasonable demand to cite, no justification that holds up under genuine self-examination. The super empath loved them well, and the avoidant, operating from fear rather than truth, responded to that love by systematically dismantling the very connection they needed most. That recognition, when it fully lands, is not comfortable. It is, for many avoidants, one of the most confronting experiences of their emotional lives. And sitting just beneath the guilt is the regret. Now, regret is a particularly cruel emotion for the avoidant psyche, because it requires the admission of something the avoidant's entire system is designed to resist. That vulnerability was worth the risk, and they chose the wall instead. Regret means acknowledging that the life they could have had, the depth of connection that was genuinely available to them, was real. It wasn't an illusion. It wasn't too good to be true. It was simply too real for them to allow themselves to receive it in the moment it was being offered. And you cannot sit with that recognition without grief. This is the dimension of the avoidance experience that almost never gets discussed: the grief. Not the performed grief of someone who has lost a possession, but the quiet, private grief of someone who understands, perhaps years later, that they were standing at a door that opened specifically for them and they chose to walk in the other direction. That kind of grief doesn't resolve quickly. It doesn't respond to time the way ordinary heartbreak does, because ordinary heartbreak is about losing someone else. This grief is about losing a version of yourself that the super empath had almost managed to reach. And then there is the longing. The longing is perhaps the most disorienting of these emotional residues for the avoidant, because it is so entirely at odds with the identity they have constructed for themselves: the person who needs no one, the person who is better alone, the person who is self-sufficient and emotionally contained and fundamentally above the messiness of deep attachment. That identity cannot easily accommodate the experience of lying awake at night, aware of a specific absence, missing not just a person but a feeling, the feeling of being known, of being held in someone's understanding without having to perform or manage or protect. The super empath gave them that feeling. And now it's gone. And the tragedy, the real human tragedy at the center of this, is that the longing often arrives too late. Not because the super empath has moved on necessarily, though they may have, but because the avoidance longing emerges only after the armor has been sufficiently worn down by absence, and absence takes time. By the time the avoidant is genuinely ready to examine what they lost and why, the window that was once open has often quietly closed. This is not punishment. This is not the universe being unkind. This is simply the natural consequence of allowing fear to make decisions that love should have been trusted to make. The super empath did not leave to teach the avoidant a lesson. They left because they had to. But the lesson arrives anyway, slowly, privately, in the unglamorous and uncomfortable space of self-reckoning. And it is in that space, in the guilt, the regret, the grief, and the longing, that something important becomes possible. Not guaranteed, not automatic, but possible. Because pain, when it is finally allowed to be felt rather than managed, has a direction. It points towards something. And what it points toward, if the avoidant is courageous enough to follow it, is the truth about who they are underneath the conditioning, underneath the walls, underneath the survival strategies that have kept them safe and simultaneously kept them alone. Guilt, regret, and longing are not signs of weakness. They are the first honest conversations the avoidant has ever had with themselves. And the question is not whether those feelings are there. The question is whether they will finally be brave enough to let those feelings mean something. We have traveled a significant distance together in this conversation. We began with a paradox: the avoidant who pushes away the very person they cannot stop thinking about. We moved through the profound, almost destabilizing experience of being truly seen by a super empath. We explored the invisible war raging beneath the avoidant's silence. We witnessed the moment the super empath's dignified departure broke through what years of patient presence could not. And we sat quietly with the guilt, the regret, the grief, and the longing that settle into the avoidant's interior like sediment after the storm has passed. And now we arrive at the most important question of all. Not what happened, not who was right or wrong, not even can this be repaired, but the question that sits beneath all of those, the question that this entire dynamic, in all its complexity and pain and beauty, has been pointing toward from the very beginning. What is this here to teach? Because here is what I know to be true about human beings, and I've spent decades studying this, sitting across from people in their most vulnerable moments, watching the patterns that repeat until they are finally understood. Nothing in our emotional lives is random. The people who affect us most deeply, who get underneath our carefully constructed surfaces and touch something real, are not accidents. They are invitations. They are the universe's most persistent and personal curriculum, delivered not in classrooms but in relationships, not in theory but in the raw, uncomfortable, undeniable experience of being human with another human being. The super empath who lived in the avoidance head, who refused to be forgotten, who haunted the quiet moments, who became the benchmark against which every subsequent connection was unconsciously measured, was not simply a person who loved them. They were a mirror. The most honest, most uncompromising mirror the avoidant had ever stood in front of. And mirrors don't lie. What the super empath reflected back was not just the avoidance capacity to be loved. That would have been gift enough. What they reflected back was something far more confronting and far more necessary: the avoidance capacity to give love. 2. Receive it without sabotaging it. To remain present in the face of genuine intimacy rather than engineering an exit the moment the connection became real enough to matter. The super empath, simply by being who they were, asked the avoidant a question they had never been asked so clearly before. Are you willing to be as courageous in love as you are in every other area of your life? Because avoidants are rarely cowards in the conventional sense. They are often extraordinarily competent, driven, intellectually formidable people who navigate the external world with remarkable capability and confidence. The avoidance is not global. It is specific. It lives precisely at the intersection of intimacy and vulnerability, the one territory where their survival programming overrides everything else. And the super empath, by loving them so completely and so clearly, exposed that specific territory with a precision that no one and nothing else had managed to achieve. That exposure is the gift, even when it doesn't feel like one. And this is the point where I want to speak directly not just to those who identify with the avoidant in this story, but to everyone in this room, because the truth is that most of us carry some version of this dynamic within us. Most of us have, at some point, chosen the wall over the window, chosen the familiar discomfort of isolation over the terrifying possibility of genuine connection, chosen to manage our feelings rather than feel them, to curate our presentation rather than reveal our reality, to protect ourselves so thoroughly that we inadvertently protected ourselves from the very experiences that would have allowed us to grow. The avoidant is not an anomaly. The avoidant is an extreme expression of a very human tendency. And the super empath, that extraordinary, deeply feeling, profoundly perceptive individual, is not a victim in this story, though they have often been treated as one. The super empath is a catalyst. Their role, whether they consciously chose it or not, was never simply to love the avoidant. Their role was to show the avoidant the precise location of their own unlived life, the exact coordinates of the growth they had been circling for years without ever landing. That is not a small thing to offer another human being. So what is the lesson the avoidant must learn? It is not, as many assume, simply to open up or let people in as though vulnerability were a switch that can be flipped once the right advice is delivered. It is something deeper and more demanding than that. The real lesson is this: the walls that protected you were built by a child who had no other options. But you are not that child anymore. You have resources now that you did not have then. You have awareness, which is the beginning of every meaningful change. You have the evidence written in the guilt and the regret and the longing that the program is no longer serving you. That the cost of the wall has finally exceeded what it was ever worth. And you have, if you are willing to claim it, a choice. Not the choice to immediately become someone different. Not the choice to undo what has already unfolded. But the choice to begin. To take the insight that this experience, painful and instructive as it has been, has carved into you, and to let it mean something going forward. To allow the super empath's presence in your life, even in their absence, to be the turning point rather than simply the loss. Because the most powerful transformations in human psychology do not happen in the presence of comfort. They happen exactly here, in the aftermath of something real, in the quiet that follows a profound loss, in the moment when the armor has been worn down just enough that the truth can finally get through. The avoidant who is sitting with their guilt, their regret, their longing, that person is not broken. That person is, perhaps for the first time, available to themselves, available to the work, available to the possibility that the story does not have to end where it currently stands. And the super empath, wherever they are, living their life with the full depth and authenticity that has always defined them, they did not love in vain. Even if the relationship didn't survive, the impact did. The mirror they held up changed something, even if that change is still unfolding quietly, in private, in the interior of someone who hasn't yet found the words for what they're becoming. That is the real legacy of this dynamic. Not the pain, not the loss, but the awakening that becomes possible on the other side of both. The super empath didn't just live in the avoidant's head, they lived in the avoidant's potential. And the only question that has ever mattered is whether the avoidant will finally choose to live there too.